Thanks for that question, Katy. Um, the example I give about the pedagogical imperative basically addresses your question. I have a colleague, his name is Alexis McLeod, who also writes about this issue, and a colleague, Tracy Laniera, and many others. The short, the short version is it's linked to that point I made also about potentiated double consciousness, and it is this. Instead of us working with the stereotypical east-west or north-south dichotomy, and by that what I mean is what we have inherited is a way of thinking about knowledge that is very Hegelian. And what Hegel basically said, G.W. of Hegel from 19th century, is that thinking begins in the East, but it matures in the West. And you can see how condescending that is. However, a lot of the people who make those claims don't take the time to read what's discussed in the South. And it's striking that a lot of the work I do actually deals with what I call shifting the geography of reason. And what that involves is being able to reorient ourselves and look at the ideas from people from the global South and learn from that. Now, quite often when we think about ideas, we think in terms of experience, for instance. One of the things we don't realize that's a disservice to how we deal with these questions of transforming knowledge is that we tend to look at the South in experiential terms. But the problem with experiential terms is everybody has the experience of trying to figure out their experience. And if you then, when you try to bring theory or interpretation to the experience, if you look at the tendency is to look for the theoretical frameworks from the North. The problem with that is they were building their theoretical frameworks and their experiences. So if you're only going to look at Foucault, Derrida, and Kant and all of these people from the North, what you're actually doing is actually recentering their experience as the valid experience for theory. So one of the things we have to understand is theory, ideas, thinking, education is everybody's responsibility. And once we understand that, it means we can look through the ideas from people from the global South because they're dealing with the conditions in ways that are very different from those in the North. Among those, you would see work that come out, for instance, the creolization of theory. Jane Anna Gordon wrote Creolizing Political Theory. But in addition to that, we have ideas that are all the way through from what Biko wrote in South Africa. When I teach my courses, for instance, when I teach a course on global existentialism, many people, when they teach an existentialism, they just teach a group of white guys from Europe and maybe an occasional white woman. When I teach global existentialism, I'm not reactionary. I don't exclude people such as Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, or Karl Jaspers, or Søren Kierkegaard. What I do is look at the problems also as raised by Ali Shariati from Iran, people such as Surya Aurobindo from India, people such as Nishitani Kaiji from Japan, people such as Vine Deloria, who's indigenous from the United States. But there's a lot more, people such as Maboko More, people such as V.Y. Mudimbe, people such as Nkero Nzegwu. The list goes on and on. Now, for many of you who are listening or rather viewing this, these are for you just names right now. And one of the things I do that I would recommend for many of you to do is to try to pick an excerpt from somebody from a community who's not ordinarily read, but whose work has been very influential in how the community thinks, and put that right in the syllabus. When I teach my philosophy classes, for instance, I put right in the very first day a paragraph from Antef. And Antef was a philosopher from 4,000 years ago, okay, from approximately 1900 BCE in East Africa. And I simply put it in the date, and we discuss that paragraph. Now, that does far more than go in front of my students and explain to them that Africans were writing philosophical ideas nearly 2,000 years before the classical period in Attic Greece with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and those individuals. Because you see, if they read and they've thought through the ideas of a person from that period, from like Antef, they have the concrete understanding, but even more than that, they could talk about that person's ideas. And so if somebody comes into them and say ancient Africans didn't write philosophy, they would say, well, what are you talking about? I just read one. And they could talk about the names. A lot of you, for instance, have heard the name Nefertiti, but you only know about Nefertiti as a beautiful woman. You don't know about her as a thinker, a scholar, a writer. But she and Akhenaten, her husband Akhenaten, they were some of the early people who theorized, formulated the concept of monotheism and the emanation theory of reality. So, and again, the thing is actually to read them. And similarly, I try my best to make sure that I don't simply give a list. So this is why I was resistant a little just to give a recommended list of books for people to read. I just brought up Angela Davis's autobiography mainly because many people are familiar with her name and they never may have not have thought about reading her autobiographical reflection as a work, a meditation on education. Many people may not think about Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass and a dying colonialism as a meditation on education as well. But all intellectuals, all activist intellectuals are actually also teachers because ultimately they made a commitment not to force themselves on others, but actually to present reality in a way that can be persuasive in the evidence it offers for others to be able to take hold of their learning and their freedom. This is how Antonio Gramsci was. This is also how individuals all the way through to even when I think about a 19th century adolescent like Mary Shelley, who at the age of 19 wrote Frankenstein. Frankenstein is an extraordinary meditation on the do's and don'ts of education. But we don't have to stop there. We can think of women like Christine de Pizan. We could also think about, as we reflect on these issues, that there are people in the United States or from the Caribbean, such as Sylvia Wynter, but there are more. So when I teach my political philosophy course, for instance, I teach the work of Hikyen Zen, and she again, she thought through about how the institutions of learning and the institutions of power can function in such a way that they militate against the emancipation of women. So there's, in other words, the issue that we face is not whether there are resources out there. The problem we face is a mentality that makes us think there's nothing out there. And when we believe there's nothing out there, we don't go and seek them out. Many students, for instance, when they get up in the morning, don't even realize that they start their day with a presumption that anything that's positive in their life was created by one group of people, usually white, usually male. And what's striking is that they have no idea of how much, if you were to take people of color out of history, if you were to take particularly black people out of history, right, as an example, because the stereotype of black people is that black people were in some jungles somewhere just snatched up and brute labor for slavery, when in fact, what I have to remind people is that most of the enslaved people were actually skilled labor. What what colonies in the Americas and in the South Pacific benefited from was actually the knowledge these people offered. It's no accident that there was prosperity wherever there were African enslaved people brought in, because you see, a lot of them were people who had skills of everything from medicine to education, all the way through to agronomy, all the way through to architectural knowledge. And they transformed the environments in such a way that we today are able to live the benefits of everything from soap to filament in the light bulb from Lattimore, who had assisted Thomas Edison. Edison didn't invent a light bulb. It was his laboratory that funded the research for it, all the way through to brakes, to toilets, to stoplights, all the way. There's so many things that I could go through that's a function from that was created not only by black people, but even down to the word soda. When you get a soda, that's an Arabic word. The more we can understand our history, we can understand that humanity creates the conditions for what we're able to live with today. But the mistake we have is when we take for granted the dribble that's brought to us that there's only one kind of people with the intelligence to create the positive elements in the world in which we live. And that's absolutely false. And the more we can understand that, the more we also, as continued students, can realize that it's in our capacity to develop new ideas and learn ways to transform these things. So there's a lot that you could read, but when you read, you should bring the right questions to the reading. That's also a decolonizing practice, learning the right questions. And when we read and we go through these materials, the other part to learn is that there's never, ever a book that you have actually read. A good book, a good article, a good idea is one you are reading, rereading, and continuing to learn with and from. And in the communicative practices with your fellow students, your teachers, your family, your extended community, if you understand what a learning community is, you can bring the right questions to the intellectual enterprise. I also would add, try your best, even if it's a little difficult for you, to read something that's in another language or try to learn another language, because you see, otherwise you will be completely dependent on what a select group of people are willing to translate. I try to do my research. I do my research in a minimum of 9 languages, and it wasn't easy. And I'm not actually that good in terms of my ability to speak in those languages, but I'm able to gain a level of competency that helps me realize that the world of ideas is much bigger than the world of ideas as offered to me in the English language. So there's a lot out there. You can work with it. And my advice is to open your hearts, open your mind, ask, ask the questions, and from there, work from an understanding that there's always something greater than yourself. But every day you get up learning something, that's something more than you had the day before.